Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I get to interview Jake Ford. Jake Ford is the founder of Reconnected Marketing, and we go through his story on how he founded Reconnected. Like always, if you find this video interesting, like, subscribe, leave a comment, and let me know who you want me to interview next. Well, first of all, Jake, welcome to the Theatre Career Podcast. I'd like you to be my guest right now. So thank you for spending the time and coming on.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Anytime. So Jake, if you could do a little bit of an introduction about yourself, tell us about where you studied, what you studied, did you go to university? If you did go to university, what university it was and what that was like.
Beautiful, of course. So Jake Ford. I grew up in the outer suburbs of Melbourne. My background was pretty blue collar, outer suburbs area, and one of only a few sort of coming out of high school to go down the university route. I had a lot of my group go more trade focused, so a bit of the black sheep, and then went to Monash University down the peninsula, to the Peninsula campus, in a business commerce degree, and my majors were marketing and management, which quite a broad type of degree, but I think marketing I was always interested in because of the creativity side of things, I think, and probably just really enjoyed beer commercials back then, frankly. And then I thought if you're going to be good at anything, you probably need to have a reasonable understanding of management. So took on those two majors and got about a year and a half into my degree. And I think you sort of get a foundation in the first year across all the different business units. And as it kind of got sharper into marketing, I probably lost a bit of patience through my degree, and I've always been a bit of a learn by do type of person, and had an opportunity to part-time my university and jump into a media business, which was selling media on the back of toilet doors, which I probably at the time was a bit sexier than it sounds in retrospect, but then was going part-time with uni as I did that role full-time to kind of just get a foot in the door. And that role ended up kind of getting me to my next role, and I actually ended up falling a subject or two short of actually completing my degree. But I think it was probably me in my early 20s getting kind of wiped away, getting an opportunity in a marketing sort of creative agency, and then sort of riding that wave, I guess, from there. So that's a little bit about the start of my story.
Quick question. Did you end up finishing your degree, or did you end up falling a couple of subjects short in totality?
I came to my senses when I was about 23 or 24, but the university actually cancelled that particular course at that time. So I was going to have to go back, take credits into a whole nother year to complete it. So at that point I went, I'll park it. I've luckily since paid off the HECS and I'm at peace with the decision, but I actually ended up falling a subject or two short, which is just a little bit of naivety of youth, I think.
Well, that's super interesting because that's actually you've had a very interesting story. So let's just step back a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about high school days. So you were saying that most of your friends were sort of blue collar. That's trades people work. What made you want to change and go towards more of a sort of a corporate-y, sort of a university kind of? Because that's interesting to break from the mold a little bit really early from your peer group.
I think I always growing up probably had I felt a bit of a duality in me. Like I was very sport, classic, Aussie child footy cricket type of upbringing. And so that's probably where my friendship group came from. But probably academically, I wasn't a superstar by any stretch, but I enjoyed school. I enjoyed maths and English and literature and those types of things. And I feel like as you sort of get to that 16, 17 years old, I remember for work experience, I was a glazier with one of my family friends, and I hated that week. That wasn't me. So I think that experience probably then tipped me into following a bit more of the academic line. And then I think a few of the friendship group went down the trade line, and by that stage I probably picked my lane a little bit.
Right, interesting, because that's actually a really interesting insight into the way that you've gone about setting up your own company. It's always quite hard when you're that young, and I would say that immature, to sort of have some sort of idea in what you want to do. I remember when I was younger, I fell into engineering myself personally, Do you know why I fell into engineering? The fundamental reason was everyone in my family studied engineering. Not one of them was an engineer. So the family tradition was study engineering, but don't go working in engineering. So I followed the family tradition route and went in there. So that's quite interesting that you had that insight at an early age, that you kind of had some idea that you wanted to do, and there was a little bit of interest and some sort of passion there, something festering underneath there that you wanted to do. So you finished year 12. Did you get good grades? Because getting to Monash University is actually not... Monash University is a top tier university in Victoria.
It's a good uni. I think I was aiming for something like I couldn't remember exactly, but 85-ish type of enter, and I think I landed a 79. So I think I was going for business commerce at Caulfield, which was kind of the premier business place at the time anyway. I'm not sure if it still is. And ended up getting a 79, which pushed me down to basically the same course, just down at the peninsula. So you could get access to the same course, but just at a different campus.
Right. I think you got more out of that degree than... yeah.
That might be my real university story. But yeah, I ended up down there because of the 79, which was, so it was the whole take off down to uni, didn't know anybody else. Travel down the East Link from Ringwood down to Frankston, so picking up the finer parts of Melbourne.
Right, interesting. And I've got a question for you. When you do hire people now in your own business, do you ask them what university you go to or what campus you went to?
I think when Monash comes up, I definitely do.
Right.
Did we bump shoulders or anything like that? I think so. I'm probably a little bit foreign with some of the other unis, so I might glaze over that if someone says Melbourne or RMIT or Swinburne, because I don't know as much about them. But yeah, definitely if Monash comes up.
That's an insight. So that's interesting. Excluding the Monash University, I think that's one thing that I think students can pick up there, is that if you do want to get into a top tier university, I don't think anyone really is going to care too much about what campus you got into. And also, as you'd be aware as well, you can also get into not necessarily a top tier university. You can get into a non-top tier university, get good grades, and transfer into a top tier university. So I guess the moral of the story here is your year 12 grades, you should study. By all means, you should study, but they do not define what happens to you in your life if you don't get into the university you want.
I remember it being quite a black and white moment of you have a whole 2 years basically aiming at this number, and then it is stunning how little that number means the day after. You know, you get your uni into that first course, and there's so many amazing options open to you in
Absolutely.
Uni, work, life. Like the amount of time you spend beforehand thinking about it to afterwards is stark, but you probably have to live it to really understand that. I think you can understand that academically, but it's probably something you have to live, but it's a good thing to know and have confidence in.
Absolutely. And to be honest, when I was in year 12 as well, this is back in the enter days, not before the ATAR
same here.
days. But
I'm enter. Yep.
yeah, so we're in the same age group there. Interestingly enough, I remember fondly being told by a school teacher that, you know, if you don't get into a university, you really have to really consider what's going to happen with your life. And well, guess what? I didn't get into the top tier university as such. I didn't actually really learn what I wanted to do until probably about 5 or 6 years into actually working itself, which is another, you know, an interest interesting insight that I learnt. But, you know, everything's kind of turned out okay. So
that's it.
On that front, yes, study hard, but it's not the end of the world. So in university, you've actually had a very interesting insight. So you were in university and you decided to go part-time and actually start working in marketing itself. What drove that? That's not a usual thing that people do.
It was a random opportunity. It was I think I was probably, even at university, I probably maintained my kind of good enough, but you know, just okay grades and things like that. And I remember thinking it was probably getting, for me, just slightly repetitive and getting deeper into things which I was finding interesting, but not as much as the lure of getting in and learning on the job. So when an opportunity popped up to reduce the university time and go and work in media, which is one part of the marketing world, it was just a little bit too tempting to go and do it, to be honest. I thought, let's go learn on the tools and apply some of this stuff. So yeah, ended up in in a media company selling toilet doors. Like I said, I at the back of toilet doors, which is not the most glamorous of beginnings, but I like reflecting on it now. It's nice when you're out of it afterwards. Basically cold calling, flat out. So I was kind of had a cold call list that I had to hit every single day to kind of prove to the boss that I worked hard. Selling, trying to get media agencies to purchase the space behind toilet doors. So doing that whilst doing uni, I've no doubt that uni would have suffered a bit because you just don't have the same time and energy put into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But I think on reflection, I look at it and I think there's a bit of a pattern of me kind of just jumping into something and probably a little bit before you're ready, and sort of learning how deep you can jump before you sink.
Yeah, well, that's actually a key insight. And one thing that people actually completely forget is, why do you go to university? It's to get a job in some sort of professional career. It's not just to, for 90% of people, there are people who want to be professional academics, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's what I'm saying. But it is to actually get a qualification to be able to work. Now, the mere fact that you were able to actually do some of that practical work while you were studying is actually a great opportunity when you actually do go into work, because unbeknownst to anyone at university, when you actually go and get a real job outside of university, that first week of your first job, and I will get into what some of that was like as well, is really a insight of, I just spent 4 years learning something and I really don't know much. And when people ask you something, you might know some of the terminologies, but you actually don't know how to do anything practically. So the fact that you have the insight into studying part-time and working full-time, which I actually did in my professional career as well, which I'd like to really actually just dive into right now. What was that like? What was studying effectively part-time and working part-time like, in terms of the number of hours that you had to do, the different mindsets you have to be in as well? So at university, you've sort of got to have that purist mindset. The answer is this, or you have to explain it to this. Whereas in the real world, it's, I don't care what the answer is. Did you get the sales? What are you doing to get the sales? And how are you going to get more sales? I think that's kind of the answer that you had to do. So how did you contrast those two, and what was the stress like there?
Oh, I'd love to say I mastered it because I don't think I did. I feel as though, yes, because it's difficult, because it's really difficult. I think I found the newness and the shininess of work and the reward of work, particularly if you're doing well, very difficult to then not want to put extra hours into that to continue to do well, because you're probably for the first time you're earning an okay wage and you're getting, for me as well, like my personality, getting pats on the back from people who you're looking up to at the time. Difficult to then balance that kind of time and energy you need to put into learning something new and mastering it. So I know when I was doing it well, it was very much having to set up different environments that I could actually access that mindset of being able to take on knowledge and truly absorb it, versus just kind of blank eyeing pages of, we had books back then, probably not anymore, but blank eyeing a whole textbook, or getting to the end of it and going, can't really remember what I was studying this evening. So I think that was a trick that I still do now, trying to set up different environments to access a more creative, workflow, or we just need to smash some finance out and some things that are a little bit more right brain. Right. But yeah, I think it's something that particularly at 2021, like I look back and go, I probably didn't all that well, and testament to not finishing the degree might be a good example that work won at the end of the day.
Right. Let's get to that, but that's a great insight that you were just talking about there. So you were saying that while you were in that sort of that creative environment, or you had to do some finance or something, you changed your environment. Tell me a little bit about what would you do to change your environment, because that's a key insight on how you can help yourself sort of hyper focus and do something really well. What would you do that's a very intuitive thing to do. It's not very intuitive, sorry. It's a very bespoke thing to do. But tell me, how did you come about that idea, and what did you do to change your environment?
It's a good question. I think I in terms of coming about it, I feel like it probably came from after school studying, that like my bedroom was where I studied, and that every other part of the house was, that's leisure or whatever it is, and at school you're at school. And I think that probably just carried on through my high school years, and then what I found was that I couldn't at work, I wouldn't try and blend work and uni. But then when I came home, it'd be you're at the desk, and that's your place of university, and I wouldn't really bring work there either. And I think for me, like even now, as I work professionally, I don't very very rarely do I take my laptop down and sit on the couch. Like the place of work is at the desk, and I think for me it's just an environmental mindset, like that I can that you've got certain environments you're going to do certain work in a better way. And that back then, I think when I was doing it well, I certainly did pretty well. But I wish it was all the time, but it probably wasn't.
No, that's great because that is a great thing because I think what you were saying there is that environment actually allows you to actually concentrate and do one thing well. And your environment plays a big part in what you do. Just little things like changing the lights in a room can actually change the way that you do things. A classic example is if you've got more white light in your room, it may actually help you actually focus and stay alert more. Little things like that. And I've actually heard psychologists say that as well. You shouldn't study on the couch, for example. It's not the environment to learn. It's not the environment to be creative. It actually helps you, it puts those distractions in there. So that's actually a really, really great insight into the way you did that. Now, while you're working, which was really interesting, what was that first sort of, so how many days were you working part-time? Was it 2-3 days part-time?
Oh no, I was working full-time, studying part-time outside of work.
Right.
Yeah, went full nose.
Gotcha. Sorry. While you're working for full-time, what was that first year of work actually like? How long did it take you to sort of get used to doing prior to university, you don't really do a 40-hour week or a 37.5-hour week. What was that first week like, or the first month, and how, like, working, and how long did it take you to sort of get used to that sort of different environment?
Yeah, I remember being incredibly nervous. You feel very exposed. I think you walk into an environment where you can probably hide more in university, and you can hide behind, a theory or a philosophy or a discussion or an argument or whatever. Whereas when you're particularly in that type of environment, which is a pretty pick up the phones and you've got a meetings booked number and a sales made number always present on the wall, I felt very exposed, and nowhere to hide, and you had to put the work in, and you start terrible. You're not good at, and nothing I learned in my marketing degree told me how to cold call or how to persuade. I had to kind of rely on other parts of my life to try and help me literally pick a phone up and get a meeting. So I remember feeling really nervous at the beginning, and then exposed when it didn't start all that well. And to be fair, the environment they were really understanding and nurturing. It wasn't like the Wolf of Wall Street or anything. Like, it was a pretty humble little sales cauldron. But we got to probably, I'd say 3 or 4 months until I felt somewhat comfortable and was starting. I think that comfortability probably was why. I think that probably led a little bit of success in actually, booking some meetings and making some sales and things like that. But it takes a bit of time to, go from really work beforehand. For university, for me, was working in a supermarket, and university to, you are now accountable to people who are serious professionals, who are wanting results, and it's that person's business. It's it's an exposing environment to contrast yourself into, and to try and do well, and to wrestle with your ego where you've done quite well beforehand, and to come in and be really quite poor at something and have to learn. It's a big change.
Yeah, definitely. And that concept that you were just talking about, I wouldn't mind having a bit of a chat about that. It's that whole concept about wrestling your ego. Because in university, you're sort of incubated and you're sort of catered for, and everything's sheltered. And if you get something wrong, you can always make it up on the next sort of exam. But whereas when you're in the real world, it's really you against the world, and you might get great grades in university or whatever. When you get in the real world, you've got to practically be able to apply those skills. And that whole concept of the ego and being able to overcome that. Did you have a process on how you did that, or did you just kind of take a step back and say, I've just really got to stop beating myself up? Or did you beat yourself up a lot when you were kind of not getting things right? or going home scared? Did you have any of those feelings?
I think I'd be lying to you if I said I had anyway mastered it in that instance. I think I feel as though I've always been able to create a reasonable relationship with whoever the boss is, or whoever my manager is. And I think at that point, I probably was able to lean on my relationship skills with my management to kind of buy some patience until I could work hard enough to get to some results. And in a way, that was me protecting my own ego. That was me going, I don't have to face into how poor I am at this, which frankly actually slows down your learning. So for me, it's probably only something I've only recently really started to understand about myself. But I think back then I look at the first 4 or 5 years of my career and go, the amount of time I spent with my trying to put on a professional mask and hide my insecurities and hide the things I don't know, instead of leaning in with a bit of vulnerability and a bit of, that's scary as well, but leaning in and actually acknowledging the things I didn't know and trusting that my manager or the environment would actually then sort of get around me and give me the feedback and the learning to actually improve, I think actually really slowed me down in my first particularly 5 years of my career. And I think I probably I didn't learn that lesson in that first job. I probably got away with it enough and was doing well enough to sort of cover my wage and make a little bit of money. But I think at that point, if I learnt the lesson there, maybe that would have been the best thing that could have happened to me. But really, I probably just charismaed a little bit of my way through and had a bit of luck with some sales and stuff. But I don't think I really learnt that lesson there, to be truthful.
Interesting. So let's if you don't mind, talk a little bit about that, because I think that is a key insight to any sort of student coming out of university, going into the real world. What Jake's talking about really is accepting some of the failures that you take, and not necessarily I did this the same. And even there's aspects of my job that I do now that I kind of glaze over and try to use my personality to get out of. But really, when you do make mistakes and you don't get something right, really accept that you've done it wrong. And sort of the first step is to accept what you've done. And then the second thing is, what could you have done differently? I think that's a key insight into when you're working and learning something different, is first accept what you've done wrong and really learn what you could have done differently. And don't try and glaze over it and say, look, it wasn't really my fault, it was John's fault, or I didn't get enough leads, or I didn't get someone else's problem. Do you want to just give me an insight of what you could have done better in those circumstances?
Definitely. I think you're right. I think you need to accept it, and then you need to be willing to learn of it. And I certainly wasn't when I was younger. So I've got this example I always use. So when I moved into my second job, I was in a creative agency, and I worked there for a long time. But at the very beginning, they did lots of promotions and retail and sponsorship style work. And there was this promotion that we were running, and basically it was up in northern Queensland, and it was for a beer called Carlton Dry. And basically, we had these promotional staff that would go pub to pub with a sort of fake like washer, like a dryer, like you'd dry your clothes in. And basically, if you bought a Carlton Dry, you could go up to the dryer, spin the dryer, and pull out a pair of briefs. And the briefs would have a prize on them or not. And that was a promotion that we ran for about 4 months. Would you believe it? And glamorous toilet-ridden career it's turning out with these stories. But
we've all done those jobs.
We've all done them. Anyway, it was one of the first jobs that I had to do when I went into this next job. This is my proof I didn't learn my lesson in my first job. But as we went into this second job, and it was the first project I was working on, there was a line item in the budget and it said premiums. And I had no idea what premiums was. It's just language that just lives in this world, but I couldn't put my ego aside enough to just ask somebody what a premium was. Right. And this line item was in this budget, and I was responsible for it. And I couldn't ask somebody because my ego, I didn't want to show I didn't know. And it went on for weeks, maybe 4 or 5 weeks. And I was sitting there going, I don't know what number I'm tracking against this thing because I don't know what it is, until about 5 weeks later, and it just got to a crunch point where I was in a meeting room and I was about to be exposed. So it was only me going to be exposed to the group that made me actually turn to the person next to me and go, hey, do you know what the premiums are? And she turns around and says, "Oh, it's just the jocks that go in the dryer." I'm like, "Oh, great. I've been anxious about this thing for how many weeks?" And all it was the 12 pairs of jocks that go in the dryer. So it was, and I still probably didn't quite learn the bigger lesson, but it's one of the many smaller ones that probably led to a bit of a real.
Yeah, and I'll add something to that as well. As you get more senior as well, that if you don't learn that issue with ego, that will get worse and worse and worse, because what will actually happen is, I think about it now, you go into an entry level job, you kind of don't know anything. You can use the I'm a student example, and then play along, and then effectively trying to figure it out. But that's the wrong way. But if you keep that behavior as you go through your career, when you're a senior person, that ego of I don't know something will be bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and you'll be more scared to ask people those questions. I had an actual example about, I can't remember what the acronym was, but there was an acronym they were using at work, and it was probably about a month, and people were using this acronym, and I had no idea what it was. I had no idea what it was, and I just had to actually just pull aside one of the senior managers and say, "What do you mean by when you say this?" And if you want to improve in your career faster, have that the sooner you can have those conversations of I don't know something, the faster you'll progress. Now, I know you were saying 5 years. I think I probably did that for 5-6 years as well. And it's only really now, where I'm 15 years into my career, where I actually, and I still do it as well, I go in and say, I don't actually know what you're talking about. And I find as well that a lot of senior managers, especially like CEOs, they just have that skill of, if they don't know what someone's talking about, they'll stop them mid-track and say, explain what that means. That's a skill that if you can learn quicker, you will actually advance in your career a lot faster.
Totally agree.
So you've effectively, let's summarize a little bit. You've gotten into a pretty good university, even though the campus thing that that no one knows about. You've gone in. You were studying. You ended up working full time and studying part time, which is another great thing. I think, even if it's part time working, part time studying, there are part time jobs out there, by the way, in professional careers while you're studying. And getting that practical experience really helps when you get your first full-time job. Your studies kind of dropped off a little bit, if I was to say accurately, and then sort of your career's kind of taking off. I'd almost say, even though you didn't get your formal qualification, you earned your formal qualification through like a trade version of it, if that makes sense. Yeah, I was gonna say, did you really, Definitely. So I've actually interviewed people on the podcast who actually never got a formal education, and they run their own businesses right now. So that's not to say formal education has no place, but it's not the be all and end all of anything. And by the way, if you do start your formal education, make sure you do have to pay it off, as you would have learnt. And just to give everyone an example, I am 40 years old right now. I think I was 38 when I finished paying off my student loans, so, or HECS as we call it in Australia. So they do pile up and they are expensive. So there is a value to that. So you kind of didn't finish your formal qualifications, but then sort of gain the skill set that you required to anyway to get a job. What was the second and third jobs like? So you stayed in that job. How long were you in that role for?
About 12 months. Yeah, so I lasted about 12 months, and then I actually tried to sell the bathroom to my next employer, and it was actually, it's again interesting sort of circles now that I was back on it. But I the person who I was selling it to, I actually knew from back out in Ringwood, where I grew up, and he was one of the other people that he did relatively similar path business, ended up in marketing, but a few years older than me, and he knew what I did, and I was helping him out with a campaign for Origin Energy, which is an energy provider here. And long story short, the way we went about that, we kind of had to hustle and do some late night stuff to try and get this certain proposal over the line for him, which he really appreciated it. And he basically at the end of that process, the job didn't get up. And honestly, if he sold the job in, I don't know if I could have done it. It was probably me reaching again a little bit. But just the way we went about it, he really appreciated and ended up offering me, a role off the back of it. He had a junior position in his team. And that's where, so CUB, which is the brewery down here in Melbourne, he was running that account in all the sort of sponsorship and retail-y sort of stuff. And we ended up, he basically said, do you want to come work on a beer truck around all the music festivals in Australia? And I said, that sounds absolutely wonderful. It's that or selling toilets. I think I was probably halfway to St Kilda Road by the time he finished the phone call. So that was in a creative agency called Traffic. Which is part of kind of a bigger network of other marketing agencies. Basically started from the bottom rung there and came in as an executive into that business, which is the most junior role. I ended up staying there for almost 10 years. So I think I was there only till about a year ago, but was able to there's probably a few chapters in that 10 years. It was probably the first chapter of... Oh, do you want to jump in?
No, I was just going to say, I'm just looking at your LinkedIn profile right now. I've got it up on one of the screens and I'm having a look at it. Now, there's just a lot to unpack on what you've said, and you've repeated a topic that I really would love to get into. So there's two key things I'd love to have a chat about. First of all, you were saying that you should always do a little bit of stretching. You sort of took on a role that you thought was just sort of always a little bit over the waterline level. I think that's another key insight that you mentioned there. I think any role that you should go for, you should always, whenever you apply for a different role or try something new, always try for something that's always a little bit over your waterline, I would say. And part of the reason for that is if you just do sideways position changes where even if it's a $5,000 job increase or a salary increase or something like that, that concept of stretching will actually enable you to not just to get the $5,000, but it could be a $10,000 or $20,000, or it could be an absolutely different paradigm in terms of your career level. So it's key to stretch in anything that you do. Now, when you said it was a bit of a stretch to get into that first role, can you give us an insight on how big of a stretch that was?
It was, I think at the time, it's funny when you look backwards and again, you're right, because you look backwards and you go, it probably wasn't as big a stretch as it felt at the time.
Yeah, everything feels
so
bigger.
You're very right. When you actually look at the reality of the role, I think I went from a very salesy focused role, which was very transactional and very short term. It's book a meeting, sell it in, pass them off to the person to deal with the execution, to basically being the execution. In a business, which when you're in the execution side of a role in a creative agency, your job is literally to make things that haven't been made before. Creativity is two things that haven't existed before coming together. And I was kind of in a production-y type of role, which means that the creative folks had come up with some physical idea of building this thing to go to a certain event, or touring this thing around the country, or going to this sponsorship thing. And it was, we want to do this thing, and the reason they're excited about it is because they haven't seen it before. So I kind of went from this very transactional short-term role to you're the kind of last, at least I felt like, you have to carry the torch for this thing and work with various suppliers to make some stuff happen they're not really comfortable with. And I had support, so it wasn't me by myself. I had a manager and that type of thing, but very different like the skills required were very different. And I think that's why I felt like it was a real stretch. It was I think probably, again, my ego probably made me think I could do it. And I think the thing I'll say on what you just said beforehand, which I think is really important, is it saddens me when I read things like, 100% of male applicants will, put their name forward for something they might only be 60% qualified for. But as a female, a lot of our female colleagues, they wouldn't do that. And I think there's two sides of that coin, because I equally think, I think it's a good lesson for females particularly, and I've interviewed lots of people in my roles coming up, that you're probably more capable than you think, and also to if you're erring, jump. That's
a super interesting statistic. And let's just not glaze over that, and let's just get into that a little bit. And I think, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but generally for males, if they read a job description and they can do kind of 50-60% of that, they will apply. They will dead set apply for those jobs and then kind of bluff it and sort of fake it till you make it a little bit in that industry. What's interesting is what I think from memory, reading that article was basically women, if they, or females, when they look at a job description, if they can't do 80 or 90% of that, they won't apply. And I think for anyone who's looking at a job description, take the 60% rule. If you can do 50-60% of that role, apply for it. Do the research you need to, by all means, to get through that job interview. Learn all the language and the terminology and do the research, but get through that. The ability to fill that role, you will learn that on the job. It will be, it won't be the most fun process in the world, but definitely apply. What's also interesting about that is if you look at statistics between males and females, in terms of education levels, women are more educated generally than men. And another thing you actually said as well, apart from just stretching, and I think that's another thing. So yes, definitely, when you apply for a role, make sure it's a bit of a stretch role. The second thing is, you did just what it takes to get that first job across the line. Like that, just understand that to be successful in work, it's not about rocking up at 9, finishing at 5. Those two concepts, think of them as guidelines. When you're earlier in your career, you might have to do longer hours just to get things done. Because what really matters in work, your work career, is not how many hours you do or the lack of hours. There is a correlation between doing more hours and getting more successful, yes, but it's what you can deliver on. If you need to deliver on each one of those projects. So that was a great summary of what that first role was and some of your career highlights. Now, I think we'll quickly brief through the rest of what that role was. I always try and keep it to 30 minutes for the career side, but it always blows out. But you want to tell me, so I'm just having a look at your LinkedIn career, your LinkedIn bio here, and it says at that role, you actually started as just an account executive, which is quite a junior role, but you worked there for 10 years and you worked yourself all the way up to managing partner. What was that like? So tell us a little bit about that history and what skills, and we can go through some of the case studies that you sent through to me, and I'll link them up here. But you sent me some case studies, and it basically goes through 3 levels of understanding or actualization and through your career. And the first one is like socialized understanding, where you kind of at the start trying to agree with everyone. You don't want to, you don't want to be the outlier. The second is you sort of self-actualize. You are kind of that outlier. You can pick the holes in the projects and you're trying to problem solve. And then that third level is you don't just pick the holes in that project, but you can also see how that connects with other projects, and you can pick the holes and you start looking for holes in that phase. So there'll be a link to that study down below if anyone's interested in reading that. But talk me through your personal experience on that journey.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Yeah, and I feel like, so I was like, luck plays a lot in this, and circumstance plays a lot in this. But yeah, but I think from 21 to 27 or 28, I went from bottom rung to managing partner, which was a great privilege and a lot of trust from the CEO at the time, and I really appreciated that. And we went on a very, very funny journey together, which incorporated some pretty business as usual stuff, then a demerger, and I was lucky to actually went to leave the business and had an opportunity to essentially restart the Melbourne office with one client. And honestly, I reckon he was probably at the time going, we'll see if that works or it doesn't work. And it clicked, which was lovely. And we ended up building that office up to 15 or 20 people, and then re-merging back with the company we demerged with. So I guess from a management perspective, was probably exposed to a lot of relatively heavy business stuff, where within marketing agencies you can get a bit incubated just on running another marketing project and running another marketing project, whereas I was just through circumstance, like plugged directly into the CEO really young, and probably overexposed, which was good from a professional perspective, but I certainly, come COVID, like emotionally, I wasn't ready to take on a lot of the work we had to do in terms of letting people go, and probably that ego kicked in again when, you know, the hard calls had to be made, and the right thing to do was to get behind the business and make those hard calls. And it's not that they weren't there to be made, but my ability to self-regulate and make those and not let that boil over wasn't quite, like, I certainly wasn't there. Like, I really fell on my sword during that time and had a tough time with that. But like you mentioned the study, which I'm a big fan of, and think through those lenses a lot, and interview through those lenses, interestingly. Essentially, yeah, I think you explained it really well. You've got, when you typically sort of pop up into adulthood in your young 20s, everyone sort of starts in that socialized mind, which is very primal, right? It's like, let's not get left behind in the tribe, otherwise you get eaten by a lion type of stuff. And then as you begin to build confidence and you're able to navigate more complexity, you start to build a bit of an idea of self-authorship, like what do I want my story to be? And you're able to kind of go against the herd if it's sort of not going with the narrative you've got for yourself or your people. And I think that's probably where I got to in traffic. I had a real idea that through the exposure I had, I could do some stuff that was perhaps a bit beyond my years and could push the boundaries of relationships and projects and the business. And that meant that I was able to help support the business in growing with some horizontal or some vertical integration and kind of lead the charge in the integration of that into the business. And then was able to finish off a really lovely 10 years and really look back really fondly on my time in the Clemenger Group broadly. And
Absolutely. And that's a great lead into the next part. And I'd just like to add one note on that. So in those three buckets, effectively, that socialized view where you don't want to argue with people, then you get into the sort of the more self-actualized ones where you are looking at picking holes and then looking at problems. The biggest growth actually doesn't come from being actually in any one of those buckets. It's when you change from one of those buckets to the next bucket. That's where all the hard decisions need to be. That's when you have to question your beliefs. That's when you have to question your ego. Those kind of transformational changes. I'll have to edit that out. Those transformational changes, is where the growth comes from. So for anyone listening to this, basically, where you're at a stage in your life and you need to make a change, and it's got that feeling in your stomach that wants to rip your guts out, that is a pinnacle point in life where something big is likely to happen, and you just have to, as I say to everyone, you've got to go through the meat grinder. You just have to go through the meat grinder, and when you come through the other end, it's lovely. Going through the meat grinder could be painful, but please don't walk away from those opportunities. They are the biggest opportunities you'll get in your life. I could spend another 3 hours talking about everything you said. You know, things like being opportunistic, making your own luck. I think you did that in a sense. But let's leave from that path where you were from sort of paid employee status to jumping out of the pot and in straight into the fire, and you founded Reconnected. One question I'd love to ask all founders is, where did the name come from?
That's a really good question. So Reconnected's got sort of two meanings. It's the first meaning for Reconnected is kind of functionally how the business operates within marketing. So it's a marketing agency, and it's about the disconnection of marketing to actual businesses, and probably fundamentally trying to solve how marketing can get better in sync with business, because I think at times can get a little bit caught in its own bubble, and has been relegated at times and in some instances to kind of the weakest member of the C-suite. And I think that we're at a time and a point within the sort of marketing world where the literature has actually given us the tools to lead businesses again. So that's like Reconnected version 1, and there's a far more emotional, that's the rational one. Far more emotional version of it though as well. I think it's from a marketing agency perspective, my experience, and it's I think a little bit systemic, is that it's the marketing creative agency world can be really brutal, as lots of different industries can be, and I think I'm really hell bent on creating a space and an environment for, where people are able to really access and reconnect to life. Because I think there is a world where you should be doing gigantic hours, and the world is always on now, and there is just a reality of how you need to operate in corporate Australia. At the same time, though, I think that can be done with you not losing yourself within it. And I certainly felt like at times I was just systemically forced to compromise and deprioritize things that I don't think people need to deprioritize. So there's actually a second part of Reconnected, which is far more people and human resources focused. Yeah, definitely. It's about getting the best from people, because they're people who want to perform really well in marketing and do excellent work, but they also want to be excellent in other parts of their life. And we're trying to create an environment and a work mode where that's possible.
Excellent. And just on that too, what I've also heard is a theory that someone said to me is a stressed person thinks like a 4-year-old. So if you ask you put a gun to someone's head and you say, "What's your name?" That's super high stress. They may not even be able to answer that. It's that whole fight, flight, flee kind of mentality. Now, in terms of Reconnected, tell me a little bit about the culture. What is the culture that you have that you fostered in your business that allows for that to work? So that whole allowing people to sort of grow in their roles, but likewise having the ability to sort of effectively be reconnected to society and other things in their life as well.
Yeah, definitely. So the first person we brought into the business was actually our head of people, which is pretty ironic because we only had 2 people at that time. So it was almost the head of person. But we wanted to build it before they came. So Nikki Henningsen, who came in as our head of people, is an amazing lady. And when I was kind of early doors Reconnected, there was a business who I was looking to try and work out and define to myself even what this was. Like, it sounds a bit complete now, but at the time I just wanted to put a bit more good out into the world, and bumped into a company called the Tomorrow Architects, and they're a consultancy who help businesses in lots of different ways, but in this instance we're actually working together to create a deliberately developmental organisation which is helping people essentially up the sort of ladder you mentioned earlier. So we're in our first year, so we've got about a village of sort of 10 to 12 people who work through a variety of full-time, part-time, etc. with us, and ultimately the cornerstone of everything comes down to 2 things. It's the humility to be able to be to be your true self. You need to have that capability and maturity to be authentic. But the second thing is it's actually heavily based on feedback, because you also need to be able to deliver and take feedback and know that it's meant not to hurt your ego, but to help develop and move you forward. So the culture we're building, and I'll put a big emphasis on building, like we are a couple of steps into a very long journey, and I'm looking forward to the 5-year reunion podcast. But
absolutely.
But they are the 2 cornerstones of everything we're going to do.
Absolutely. And how do you create? And this is interesting because those things that you're talking about, letting people be vulnerable, effectively receiving and giving feedback, that means they have to be effectively a little bit of an open book. And as we discussed earlier, that you've got that ego at the start, sometimes you don't know to ask someone what in an accounting sense, what's EBITDA mean? That was one of my questions. I didn't know what it meant, and I was working in finance. How do you foster that environment where people are able to be vulnerable in their workplace, yet they're able to be vulnerable, but they can take the feedback and actually accept it and not necessarily put that shield up where it just kind of bounces off them, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think there's lots of side doors that I've successfully and unsuccessfully opened to try and create that relationship with somebody. I think first and foremost, if the leadership don't believe it, it will not happen. So right. I think I have to lead from the top, and our leadership will need to lead from the top moving forward as well. Like, if we aren't driving it, it will not happen, because I'm a massive believer in the modelling of leadership and how important that is. And I think often in businesses, the leadership need both an emotional reason to do it. They need to believe in it at a human level, but also at a business level. Like at the end of the day, what we do is we come up with ideas and strategies that are good for our clients. But there's a lot of other businesses that do the same thing. What we believe is that if you're wearing a professional mask 30-40% of the time, depending on what study you believe, that's a lot of time spent trying to justify, not ask what a premium is, not, go down the engineering path. It's a lot of time not being true to yourself. And it's also not an environment where you are going to throw out the third idea after your first two ideas have been shut down, but the third idea is where the magic is, right? So I think it's actually good business to create, first and foremost, as a priority, an environment where you can be vulnerable and you don't actually have to muster any courage or bravery to throw a shitty idea out there the third time, or just want to understand more to help and ask what EBITDA is. I think those two things are going to be the motivating force. Ultimately, that it's going to help from a business perspective, but also we just fundamentally believe it's the right thing to do for our people, and we want to work in that environment.
And that's actually that's a great lead into that as well. And I totally agree with you. You can put in any process in place. I got asked in a job interview, what's the hardest thing to change in a company? And I think I said systems or something. No, it's people. It's people are the hardest things in a company to change. But you're right. It has to be driven from the top down. If the leadership and the managers don't believe in the philosophy and don't practice the philosophy, it will never, ever, ever get pushed down. You covered off on so many great points. That whole thing about that fake, that mask that you wear, that you spend so much time defending, where you could just effectively get rid of the mask and you can just put out. And you don't want someone just sitting there and go, oh, what about this and what about this and what about this? And you do want some thought behind that idea. But I find the challenge more in business isn't that people are giving too many options, it's that they are not giving enough, because the first two ideas got shot down, but the third idea was this stupid thing called an iPhone that who's going to do that one, right? You know what I mean? But that ability to, and this leads into the next question I'd love to have a discussion about, and we might go a little bit over if that's okay with you. Perfect. So effectively creating that environment leads into sort of being able to let people be comfortable to come up with those additional ideas and learn from the mistakes and, give feedback and all that sort of stuff. And actually, do you think that leads into where it gives Reconnected their edge effectively? I find my experience with business, I'm creating a business, digitizing things and digitize learning. I kind of think business is like an evolutionary process. You know how evolution came up with us? It says, oh, let's give it 10 fingers, and oh, that didn't work, they all died. It's that iterative process of doing something multiple times, and the more times you can iterate through something, the better you get to that solution. So that business, for example, that's got the staff that are too scared to give the third idea, whereas yours, they're at the idea 10. Do you think that leads into your edge?
Yeah, I think that's going to be the thing. I hope I say yes continuously year on year. That's the plan. That's the plan. I think if unlocking that mask comes back to vulnerability, and I think it's Brené Brown. She says something along the lines of that vulnerability is at the center of fear and shame, but it's also at the center of joy and creativity. Like that to me is enough already to go, it's time to barrel down this path. Because I just intuitively, that was kind of putting words to something you intuitively feel. And I think for us, what that vulnerability is going to allow us to do, it's going to allow us to connect, like hence, Reconnected, but internally, and that's going to make the product better and the service that we're providing better. But I think also it's going to allow us to hopefully foster a relationship with our clients where instead of there being a bit of a bravado off, and if a client, and fair play, because I've been in environments where certain clients get a really good result out of subservient relationships, and that's right for some businesses, and full respect to that. That's just not going to be the environment I think we're going to operate in all that well, and we'll actively try and back away from those, and no doubt we'll touch the stove and get it wrong from time to time. But I think that vulnerability in terms of the relationship to client, internally, how we, I guess, prioritize and reward and incentivize that. It should be our edge. And it's interesting because you talk about how to activate this kind of thinking, and there's some amazing business case studies. I'm not trailblazing this, I'm following in the footsteps of giants, but they talk about that you've got to have a home, which is the environment that allows this day in, day out to foster. You need to have a groove, which is the rituals that you embed into the business that can keep this ever present, daily, hourly, systemically. But then you also need to find your edge. And that's to have a really great understanding that as a business and as an individual, what are you actively working on that's on the edge of your capabilities that you're trying to push out a little bit further? And I think we're just going to be really focused on making sure everyone's really comfortable to be at the edge, and that everyone at all times is aware of everyone's edges and helping each other continuously push on what our capabilities are. And yeah, I just look forward to, I think Alain de Botton, who I'm a big fan of as well, to quote him, he says something along the lines of, if you're not embarrassed of who you were a year ago, you're probably not learning quickly enough. And I hope that I can say that in 12 months.
Well, I'm definitely embarrassed of who I was a week ago. So
well, you must be learning so quickly. You're doing well.
I hope so. And trust me, I definitely take on roles that are a little bit challenging, and
good.
That what you're talking about there is having that environment where effectively you're willing to, step across the line and maybe get hit, but not get your foot chopped off. It is definitely quite interesting. Is quite not interesting. It's quite useful and it's productive to get things done. And there's so much out of what you were just saying as well. I've just made some notes here. But for example, a fundamental fact is there is only a certain amount of usable hours in a day. You have to eat. You have to sleep. Maybe you don't have to speak to people in the world, but there's only a certain amount of usable hours in the day. You will spend the majority of them at work or in paid employment. It doesn't necessarily have to be work. It doesn't have to be categorized as work. It's paid employment. The one thing you're talking about there is about building relationships with people in that environment. I think that's such a critical thing that, and to build a relationship, it's not, you can't build those relationships with two facades. They don't work. You need genuine connection with people that you work with, be able to be vulnerable with them. And to create that environment where people can do that, I think that definitely will give you guys that edge. That leads into being able to create that more integrated product. You understand where everything sort of fits into place. And one of the things you were saying as well, one belief I've always had is complex processes create complex products. You guys seem to sort of embed everything that you do within your business. So you're looking for a type of client that has that relationship build. You don't want to necessarily take on a client that will go against the philosophy of your business. That leads into something that you were just saying as well, that, everything sort of operates on the edges and not into the center. On your website, there's actually a quote that I took down, and I didn't just regurgitate this from what you were saying. And I was going to ask you what this meant, but I think you've just explained it. It says, we don't drift into the center, I'm paraphrasing, but we operate on the edges. And I was going to ask you, could you please explain what that meant? But I think you just went through that in an absolute nutshell.
Yeah, it's I actually picked that up from Dark Mofo, which is down in, I think it's Dark Mofo, or Mona, down in Tasmania. Something I got passed on. But it's a beautiful place, and they certainly don't live on the edge. And I think they have a different articulation of that. But I thought, like I said before, I think for us it's about understanding our personal edge and our organisation's edge and keeping that front of mind so we keep growing. Right,
perfect. And on that as well, I'm just looking at your website right now, and there's actually, you've got a product path that you follow. Is that, so it goes through, and I'll put a link here, so I'm going to steal one of your images for this podcast, but it goes through awareness, consideration, conversion, purchase, and evaluation. Do you want to talk us a little bit through that life cycle a little bit? And the interesting one is evaluation. I think that's something that most marketers would kind of just drop off. They'll just, okay, the purchase is done, and then that's it. That's where it is. Do you want to just walk us through that little that little insight that you've got there?
Yeah, I think in some ways you'd find a similar feel in most marketing agencies. They go down the line of trying to work through what the stages of where your consumers are at and trying to push them left to right along that funnel. I think where hopefully our kind of point of view, probably speaking more from a technical marketing perspective, less our people now,
Yeah.
where we get to evaluation is quite important, because at the moment most marketers are kind of speaking, there's lots of different topics always in every industry, but at the moment a really pertinent one for the last 10 years, really, that no one I think has, some people have solved at the very pointy end, but not many I don't think have solved, is you kind of can split your marketing into two buckets pretty quickly, which is what's your emotional advertising and what's your rational advertising. It's more performance focused. And usually you're trying to build memory structures with emotion, and you're trying to push a sale or push a subscription or whatever it is that you're trying to tangibly do as a business with your rational message. And I think what evaluation means to us, and what the whole business sort of from a technical perspective is standing on, is we're a full service agency. So we are able to do, at the moment we're doing big brand architecture pieces and building systems of marketing into certain businesses, but we're also running hardcore promotions at the same time. So we're doing the gamut. And typically speaking, a business is spending twice as much money as they need to on performance. And I think there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. Short-termism is a reason for that. The confidence to put out something very emotional is difficult when you can't really measure what is typically a haphazard amount of sort of analytics and metrics around your performance marketing. So if I'm meant to spend 50% less on that, but I can't measure it all equally, I can't just cut that in half, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, good luck. I mean, that's a brave marketer. So what our business is really focusing on doing is bringing all of that into one house, simplifying that interaction. And then in that evaluation stage, like you asked, it's actually about going on a journey together to try and get one set of metrics that we can get behind, and slowly carve that rational performance-focused marketing to back across to emotional, and finding the right balance for every business and every industry. And that dynamic, that is something that lots of marketers are talking about. And I did a lot of interviewing of marketers to work out where their value was when I left traffic. And it's a difficult problem to solve if you're an agency or you're a marketer that's embedded in the emotional camp, because you need more money and investment to do that well, right? But just yelling I need more money from there isn't going to really help you. But I probably lean a little bit more to the performance side, and I can see, like, a lot of those businesses are on the gravy train, right? Like, brave business to be like, we don't need that much money, send it across the pile, right? Yeah. But I think the right thing to do at the moment, and what Reconnected we're really standing behind, is if you can have a holistic picture, you can start to get that balance right, and that evaluation is where you make those decisions. So it's critical.
Absolutely. And if I was to summarize that, if we were looking at sort of that emotional side and effectively the old school metrics, what's your conversion rates and all that sort of stuff, is it if I was to say it's short and long term, the emotional side is how you build a brand, how you bring people in and keep them with you, and when there's a pandemic, they keep buying from you or they keep interacting with you. The short-term side is, okay, how many dollars are coming through the door, how many clicks are you getting, metrics that you can measure. And back to that whole evaluation is it safe to say that you're trying to find that balance? Is how do you bring enough money in the door to keep the business going and getting some ROI effectively for your marketing dollars, meanwhile building that engagement, building that relationship with that customer or that the B2B business, so you can sustainably grow your business. And you, over time, what you'll see is effectively you get fluctuations in your revenue, and that fluctuation should sort of level out a little bit, and you'll still get the cyclical issues, but the fluctuations because you've built that relationship.
An interesting stat that was a bit of an unlock for me was there's some work done in the last 12 months by a guy called James Herman, and he uses the language future demand. And I buy his philosophy where a good marketer right now should take ownership for all the future demand in a business. Like, you are accountable for the next 3 months, but also the next 3 years. And right now in the market for any product, B2B, B2C, anything, right? Only 5% of the audience, when a message reaches them, are actually in a buying mind, like sort of state of mind. So if you're going to hit them with a rational message, like a price or a feature or a promotion, they will respond to that because they're kind of, considering. But 95% aren't. So they're in like you and I are right now, we are not thinking about toilet paper. And which meant if you got hit with a $5.99 toilet paper promotional message on a banner ad, absolutely over the top of your head, right? But what you might remember is a funny ad or an emotional based ad. And you might not even, at the end of the day, you might not remember it, but it's that salience that when a buying situation comes up and you're like, oh, I need toilet paper. And then you think of that cute Labrador puppy that's the Kleenex puppy. And you're like, oh, I like that puppy. That's that little bit of familiarity which puts you at the top of the sort of consideration list. And I think that's the most powerful place a brand can be. Is that if you're at the top of the list when the buying situation comes along, it's hard to knock you off the top of that perch.
Absolutely. And let me just add an anecdote to that. That whole emotional side of everything and make something a little bit funny. I want everyone here to do an exercise. Tell me what you did last Thursday at 6 o'clock. Can everyone remember what they did? Do you remember what you did, Jake?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, no, I was in Bali, but not good. Probably sweating through a t-shirt. But go for it. I don't want to distract your narrative.
Second question.
Yep.
Where were you at September 11th?
Sitting on my...
When the planes hit the...
Yep. Spot on. Sitting in my family's lounge room. I'm cross-legged at the front of the TV.
Absolutely. So an emotional connection definitely does secure that bond. Now, we have gone over time. I try not to go over time. Now, tell us how does someone get in contact with Reconnected?
Sure. Well, if you link the website, you can crack in there and there's a contact page. Otherwise, I'm on LinkedIn, which is a good place to reach out to as well, and come in the DMs there. Both you'll find me or one of the team. So we'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely. So what I'll do is I'm going to send Jake an email. I'm going to get all his socials, all his websites, and we'll put all the links at the bottom of this video. Now, the second thing is, what type of customer do you actually target for? If you were going to go out and say, I've got this much resources, I want to dedicate it this, what types of businesses would you like to be working with? What's your target market in that sense?
The most important thing to me, first, primarily, is somebody who wants to create the same environment I want to create in their marketing. And that can be someone who's we're working at the moment with some owners and some CEOs who are building out the marketing function in a 30-year-old business that's in 100 countries. And we're also doing some work with startup B2B. But the commonality between all of our clients at the moment is that they want to invest into that type of environment and believe that's going to drive the best work. So that's kind of primarily number one. Yeah. And if that resonated, I could talk underwater about it for ages. So let's just catch up and grab a coffee. But in terms of what we're set up really well to do at the moment, I think we're set up incredibly well to do anyone who's in the B2B tech space. We're set up incredibly functionally well to work from a brand right through to outbound one-to-one sequences, and also in the consumer goods space. So we're doing a lot of great work in grocery and retail and that type of space for brands that need to better work with customers to maximize their commercial return and at the same time build brand. So they're probably two industries we've really matured quite quickly into. So at a more functional level there, but what I'm finding is more important is that if you can create an environment where everyone can walk to the table and be comfortable to say what they don't know, and build that social capital together, that is way more important than a deep industry knowledge, because that can be found. I just back that a team in that environment will surpass any other team in a short amount of time. So that's a long answer to an easy question. So.
No, and if you are one of those entrepreneurs who's out there, starting a business or in an existing business, and you want to migrate into that sort of that newer business model where there is a bit of a deep connection within the company itself, but also with your clients, definitely check out the links below in the bottom of this video. I think that's a great point to end this meeting with. Jake, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate everything that you've, all the wisdom that you've imparted on everyone. There is one fundamental question that I always ask. There's two actually that I ask everyone at the end. First of all, how many years did it take you to become an overnight success? Because everything happens overnight, right?
What am I? 13 and counting? I don't know if I'm there yet. It feels like I'm still counting. So I'll let you know when I get there. But I think the running total's 13.
Perfect. And the second thing is, what advice would you have to someone who's actually, there's two people, my target audience is, anyone who's looking at studying at university or effectively about to start their career, or anyone who's actually going to take that next leap and sort of, be on the edge and then jump to starting their own businesses. What kind of advice would you have for those two?
So on the career end, I would say get curious about the people who are doing the job that you think you want to do in 10 to 15 years, and you'll be surprised how reaching out for a coffee, you'll often get that coffee, or you'll get that 15-minute, can I do anything, just to kind of pick your brain. There are some lovely, lovely people out there, and like you might get 10 no's, but the one yes will be worth it. So that'd just be one, to get curious and do the work to do there. To do that, I think that's something that's worked for me and I've seen work for other people. And then in terms of someone starting their own business, one bit of advice would be get a good accountant. No, I say that facetiously. Understand your own limits and your blind spots, and fill those up quickly with great people. That is my accountant comment. Probably done in a slightly more professional way. I think that's something that I've been fortunate to get some good advice on, and get some good people in those kind of blind spots to help just miss some of the landmines that you might otherwise step on if you don't surround yourself with the right people.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Jake. I will let you go because we have gone over. Thank you so much for coming on. Yes, we're definitely going to do a 5-year podcast, and when you're IPOing this thing and it's a unicorn, I hope you still remember us over at Theatre Career. But we'll definitely be in touch. I'll definitely be following everything that you do on LinkedIn. If anyone wants to get in contact with Jake, or they've got a great product to take to market, check out all the links below, and we'll leave it at that.
Thanks, mate. Thank you so much for having me. That was a great chat discussion.
No, anytime, and we'll speak soon. Thanks. See you later. Okay, guys, so I hope you got a lot of value out of that interview. Now, if you've got a job interview coming up, or you're preparing for a job interview process, check out the link below. It's my free course on how to prepare for any job interviews. We go through the key things that knock people out all the time. Fashion and hygiene. What are the common questions you're likely to be asked? What questions do you need to prepare for? And critically, what do you do if you've started applying for jobs and you've got missed calls from recruiters? Now, those are screening calls and you have to pass those in order to get through the next stage. So if you want access to all of that, please check out the link below. Like always, best of luck with your career.